They burned his children alive in front of him. Not because he was poor, but because he owned more land than any white man in America. His banks held millions. His name was on 30 properties. But you'll never find him in history books. Because in 1921, being a wealthy black man wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. And he wasn't alone. 4 other families. Same fate. Same silence. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. History has a way of forgetting what it needs to forget. You've been taught that black people were slaves, then sharecroppers, then servants struggling to survive. What you weren't taught is that between the 1500s and 1920s, black families built economic empires so powerful they terrified the people who claimed to be superior. From African kingdoms that controlled the resources Europe desperately needed, to American entrepreneurs who owned entire city blocks, these families didn't just survive the system. They beat it. They became richer than the people oppressing them. And that became their crime. Because when a people's wealth threatens the narrative of their inferiority, that wealth must be destroyed. Not just taken, erased. Libraries burned to ash. Property deeds stolen in the night. Entire families murdered in their beds. Names scraped off maps, as if they never existed. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic economic warfare designed to make sure future generations would never know what their ancestors built. Because wealthy black families proved one terrifying truth that white supremacy couldn't allow. The whole system was a lie. Let's start with the man from the beginning. The one whose children burned. The Stratford Dynasty. J.B. Stratford arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1899 with $3 in his pocket and a law degree nobody would honor because of the color of his skin. So he did what he had to do. He worked, he saved, he built. By 1921, J.B. Stratford owned the 54-room Stratford Hotel, the largest black-owned building in the entire United States of America. But that was just the beginning. His family controlled rental properties across Tulsa's Greenwood district. They owned businesses. They held land worth $4 million. That's over $60 million in today's money. He employed dozens of people. His children attended the finest schools. His family lived in a mansion that made white Tulsans sick with envy every time they drove past it. The Greenwood district wasn't a neighborhood. It was a declaration. Over 600 black-owned businesses generated millions of dollars annually. Black doctors, black lawyers, black pilots, black oil barons. They called it Black Wall Street, and it was more prosperous than most white towns in Oklahoma. J.B. Stratford stood at the center of it all, a living contradiction to everything white supremacy claimed about black inferiority. And white Tulsa watched and seethed. Because how dare these people, these former slaves, these supposed inferiors, drive nicer cars, build taller buildings, and send their children to better schools? It was unbearable. Intolerable. Something had to be done. On May 31st, 1921, something was. A white mob surrounded the Stratford Hotel. J.B. was inside with his family, his wife, his children, his grandchildren. They could hear the crowd outside growing larger, angrier, chanting for blood. Then came the gunshots, then the torches, then the screams. The mob set the building ablaze, floor by floor, room by room. Women and children screamed from windows, trapped by flames and bullets. J.B. tried to fight back, tried to save his family. But what can one man do against 1,000? Then the planes came. Actual airplanes dropping firebombs on American citizens in an American city. The first aerial bombing of a domestic target in United States history wasn't against foreign enemies. It was against black wealth. J.B. escaped through the chaos with some of his grandchildren, running through streets that had become a war zone. When he looked back, everything was burning. Every deed, every dollar, every dream. 35 blocks of black prosperity turned to ash in less than 24 hours. Over 300 black people murdered. 10,000 left homeless. And J.B. Stratford, one of the richest black men in America, became a fugitive. He fled to Chicago, accused of inciting a riot. As if defending your family from a murderous mob makes you the criminal. His insurance company refused to pay a single cent. The city of Tulsa seized his property. His hotel, the symbol of everything he'd built, was demolished. They paved it over. A parking lot now sits where black millionaires once walked. J.B. Stratford died in 1935, broken and penniless. He was finally exonerated in 1996, 45 years after his death. His family never recovered a single dollar of their stolen wealth. And here's the truly evil part. Oklahoma removed the Tulsa Massacre from history textbooks for 75 years. An entire generation of black children grew up not knowing their city had once been the wealthiest black community in America. J.B. Stratford's name appeared in history books only as a criminal who started a riot. His grandchildren grew up not knowing their grandfather had been one of America's richest men. The erasure was complete. Until now. The Hemings-Jefferson Dynasty. Now let's talk about a family you think you know but don't. Everyone's heard of Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's enslaved mistress. But here's what they don't teach in school. The Hemings family didn't just serve Thomas Jefferson. They ran his entire economic empire. They were master craftsmen, elite chefs, skilled managers who kept Monticello functioning. And when Jefferson died drowning in debt, it was Hemings' family labor, worth millions, that had kept him afloat for decades. James Hemings was Sally's older brother. Jefferson took him to Paris and paid for him to train under French master chefs, one of the finest culinary educations money could buy in the 1780s. James learned techniques that didn't exist in America yet. He mastered French cuisine, wine pairing, pastry arts. When he returned to Virginia, he introduced macaroni and cheese, crème brûlée, and French fries to America. Yes, those French fries. James Hemings invented American French fry culture. His skills were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But he earned nothing. He was property. His brother John was a master carpenter whose furniture was so exquisite it sold for premium prices, with Jefferson's name on it. Their sister Sally managed Jefferson's entire household, supervised staff, maintained records. She knew where every dollar went, every debt owed, every secret hidden. If this family had been free and compensated fairly for their labor and intellectual property, they would have accumulated a fortune equivalent to $50 million in today's money. But here's where it gets darker. When James was in Paris, he was legally free under French law. He could have stayed. He could have become the most famous chef in Europe. But Jefferson manipulated him with a promise. Come back to Virginia, train your brother to replace you, and then I'll free you. James believed him. He came back. He trained his brother. And in 1796, Jefferson finally freed him. But freedom came with a cost. James had spent years back in slavery after tasting liberty. The psychological damage was devastating. He tried to build a life, tried to use his skills, but America, in 1796, wasn't ready for a black master chef to receive the recognition he deserved. In 1801, James Hemings was found dead. The official story: suicide. He was 36 years old. But historians now believe he was murdered. Because James knew things, He knew Jefferson's secrets. He knew the truth about Sally, about the children, about the lies Jefferson told the world. And his culinary innovations were making him famous in his own right. He was becoming inconvenient. So he died. Conveniently. The Hemings family's economic contributions were meticulously documented in Jefferson's records. He tracked everything they did, every skill they demonstrated. Then those records were buried in archives for 200 years. Sally was remembered only as a victim, never as the sophisticated manager who ran Monticello. James's culinary revolution was credited to Thomas Jefferson himself. American history books taught that Jefferson brought French cuisine to America when it was actually an enslaved black man who never got a penny or a footnote. DNA testing in 1998 finally proved what the Hemings family had been saying for 2 centuries. Yes, Jefferson fathered Sally's children. The mainstream media treated it like a scandal. But here's the real scandal. If James Hemings had been paid fairly for his recipes and innovations, if his family had been free to accumulate wealth and pass it down, their descendants would be millionaires today. Instead, they got nothing. Not even their names in the history books. Christophe Royal Dynasty. Let's travel to Haiti. 1804. The only successful slave revolution in human history has just happened. Enslaved Africans defeated Napoleon's army, the greatest military force on earth, and declared independence. Leading them was a man named Henri Christophe, born enslaved, who became a general, then a king. King Henri Christophe wasn't playing around. He built the citadel La Ferrière, a fortress so massive you can see it from space, constructed with stones carried up mountains by hand. It cost $200 million in today's money. He built Sanssouci Palace, modeled after Versailles, to prove that black royalty could rival European monarchs. He established schools, hospitals, a national currency, and a standing army of 40,000 soldiers. His family controlled northern Haiti like a sovereign nation, with gold reserves that made France nervous. But white nations couldn't allow it. America refused to recognize Haiti's independence for 60 years. France demanded Haiti pay them for the loss of property, meaning enslaved people, threatening reinvasion if they didn't comply. Britain imposed crushing trade embargoes. Haiti's economy, which should have thrived, was being strangled not because it failed, but because it succeeded. A prosperous black nation was too dangerous to exist. By 1820, Christophe was facing betrayal from within his own government and invasion from the south. He suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed him. His enemies were closing in, ready to capture him and parade him through the streets as a defeated black king. A lesson to any enslaved person who dared dream of freedom. Henri Christophe refused to give them that satisfaction. He loaded a silver bullet into a pistol, placed it against his heart, and pulled the trigger. He died standing in his palace, crown on his head, on his own terms. His wife, Queen Marie-Louise, and their children fled to Italy with whatever gold they could carry. France seized his palaces. His economic systems were deliberately dismantled. And here's how they erased him. Haiti's history books, written by foreign powers and hostile neighbors, painted Henri Christophe as a mad tyrant, a despot, a cautionary tale about what happens when slaves get power. They never mentioned his schools, his hospitals, his vision for a free black nation that needed no white saviors. The Citadel still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists visit and take pictures, but nobody tells them it represents the wealth of a black monarchy that rivaled Europe. Sanssouci Palace was destroyed by an earthquake in 1842 and never rebuilt. almost like nature itself conspired in the erasure. Christoph's descendants live in obscurity today, scattered across Europe and the Americas. They have no wealth, no kingdom, no recognition. And that was the point. Because if Haiti had been allowed to prosper, if Christoph's economic model of free black labor and self-sufficiency had succeeded, it would have inspired every enslaved population in the Americas. It would have proven that black people didn't need white masters to thrive. That terrified every slave-holding nation on earth. So they crushed it and erased it, and taught generations that Haiti was always poor, always struggling, never mentioning that its poverty was deliberately manufactured through debt, embargoes, and sabotage. The Mbemba-Nzinga dynasty. Now let's go back further. 1506, the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. This wasn't some tribal village like your textbooks implied. This was a sophisticated nation with a capital city, Mbanza, Congo, that housed 100,000 people, larger than London at the time. King Afonso I wasn't a tribal chief. He was a Catholic monarch who spoke fluent Portuguese, maintained diplomatic relations with the Pope, and controlled trade networks spanning 3 continents. His kingdom exported copper, ivory, and textiles worth millions in Renaissance currency. His family lived in stone palaces, wore imported silks, and governed using written law codes. This was a peer to European nations, not a subordinate. Portuguese traders arrived, and Afonso welcomed them as partners. Cultural exchange, trade agreements, mutual respect. But the Portuguese wanted one thing Afonso wouldn't give them enough of: enslaved people. When Afonso realized Portuguese agents were kidnapping his citizens, including members of the nobility, he wrote desperate letters to the King of Portugal and the Pope himself, begging them to stop. Listen to his words, written in 1526. "We cannot reckon how great the damage is, because these thieves and men of bad conscience grab our people, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom. Every day the traders are taking our natives, sons of the land and the sons of our noblemen and vassals." He documented everything: the kidnappings, the betrayals, the destruction of his kingdom's social fabric. He appealed to Christian morality, to international law, to basic human decency. His letters were received, filed, and completely ignored. Portugal armed Afonso's enemies instead. They funded rebellions. They encouraged civil wars. By 1568, the Kingdom of Congo had fractured into competing factions, all weakened, all vulnerable. Portuguese slavers raided with impunity. Mbanza, Congo, once a gleaming capital of stone buildings and bustling markets, became a ruin. And Afonso's family, once royalty, were captured and sold. Think about that for a moment. One generation lives in a palace, writes letters to the Pope, dines with Portuguese ambassadors. The next generation is chained in a ship's hold, bound for Brazilian sugar plantations. Royal blood spilled in fields owned by the descendants of the men their grandfather called friends. For 400 years, those letters sat in Vatican and Lisbon archives, unread and ignored. European historians wrote that Afonso was a puppet king, that he invited the slave trade, that African kingdoms had no real sophistication. His kingdom was reduced to tribal in textbooks. His legacy was erased. Those letters were finally rediscovered in the 1960s during African independence movements. Suddenly, historians had proof. African kingdoms didn't welcome slavery. They were betrayed. They fought back. They documented their resistance. But by then, generations had been taught that Africa had no history worth remembering, no civilizations worth studying, no wealth worth acknowledging. The erasure was so complete that when archaeologists finally excavated Mbanza, Congo in the 2000s, people were shocked to find stone foundations, sophisticated urban planning, and evidence of international trade. Shocked. As if Africans building cities was impossible. The Kudjo Maroon Dynasty. Finally, let's talk about a family that won, sort of. Captain Kudjo was an escaped enslaved man in Jamaica who, in the early 1700s, did something extraordinary. He built a free black nation in the mountains, not hiding, governing. By 1739, his Maroon community controlled 1,500 square miles of Jamaican territory. They had farms, livestock, manufacturing, and trade networks with British colonists. They weren't just surviving, they were prospering. And they had an army that defeated British troops over and over again. The British sent regiment after regiment into those mountains, and Kudjo's forces destroyed them all. Guerrilla warfare perfected. The British couldn't win. So in 1739, exhausted and humiliated, Britain did something unprecedented. They signed a peace treaty recognizing Maroon sovereignty. Kudjo's community was officially free, autonomous, and legally protected. The first free black society in the New World. Kudjo's family accumulated wealth through crops, trade, and yes, even arms dealing. They lived better than most British colonists, but the treaty had a poison pill buried in it. The Maroons had to return any newly escaped enslaved people to the plantations. Britain couldn't defeat the Maroons militarily, so they used law and psychology. They turned freedom fighters into slave catchers, dividing the black community against itself. It was brilliant and evil. Then came the slow erosion. British colonial authorities chipped away at Maroon land rights year by year. Legal technicalities, boundary disputes, forced purchases. What started as 1,500 square miles shrank to tiny reservations. The wealth Kudjo's family had built was slowly confiscated through paperwork and legal manipulation. By the 1800s, Kudjo's prosperous settlements were impoverished. His descendants still live in Jamaica today, but most don't know their ancestor built the first free black nation in the Americas. They don't know their family once controlled more land than any British sugar baron. They don't know they come from royalty. Because that history was erased through something quieter than violence, legal bureaucracy, and generational amnesia. Do you see it now? The pattern? 5 families, 5 different centuries, 5 different continents, but the same story every single time. They built empires. Those empires were destroyed through violence or betrayal. They documented their wealth. Those records were burned, buried, or conveniently lost. They had descendants who should have inherited everything. Those descendants were denied through legal theft, murder, or forced displacement. They proved black excellence was possible. So they were erased because their existence contradicted the lie that white supremacy needed to survive. Here's the mathematical horror of it all. If just one of these families, say the Hemmings, had been paid fairly and allowed to pass wealth down through generations like white families do, we're talking about a $50 million foundation in 1800. Compounded over 9 generations at a modest 3% growth rate. That's $700 million today. Multiply that by 5 families. Then, remember, these are just 5 stories. There were hundreds, thousands. The Tulsa Massacre alone destroyed $200 million in 1921 dollars. That's $3 billion today. Haiti's forced debt to France. $21 billion stolen directly from black hands. The Kingdom of Congo's wealth redirected to Portugal. Incalculable. This wasn't poverty. This was the largest wealth theft in human history. And then they taught you the victims were poor because they didn't work hard enough. Here's what keeps powerful people awake at night. These families weren't exceptional. They were ordinary black people given opportunity. J.B. Stratford started with $3. James Hemings started in chains. Henri Christophe started enslaved. Captain Cujo started as property. King Afonso inherited a kingdom, sure, but he was fighting European superpowers with everything he had. Imagine what millions more could have built if they'd been allowed. If their children had inherited what they'd earned. If their grandchildren had invested what their parents saved. If their great-grandchildren could have pointed to family histories of wealth and success instead of trauma and theft. J.B. Stratford's grandchildren should be billionaires today, controlling Tulsa real estate. Henri Christophe's descendants should lead Haiti's economy. The Hemings family should own Monticello and receive royalties every time someone makes French fries. King Afonso's lineage should govern a thriving Central African nation. Captain Cujo's Maroons should control Jamaican mountains and tourist industries. Instead, their wealth was redistributed to their oppressors' children, who inherited it, invested it, grew it, and still benefit from it today. Old money in America and Europe? Track it back far enough, and you'll find it's built on theft from families exactly like these. Every time someone says black people are poor because they don't work hard, show them J.B. Stratford, who built a hotel empire from $3 and watched it burn. Every time someone asks, "Where's Black Wall Street?" answer, "Under a parking lot, because you burned it." Every time someone questions reparations, ask, "Have you repaid the Stratford family yet? Or the Hemings family? Or Haiti?" They didn't just steal wealth. They stole proof. They stole rage. They stole inheritance. They made descendants forget they came from kings, queens, entrepreneurs, and revolutionaries. They turned them into statistics about poverty and fed them lies about why. But you can't burn truth forever. Ashes still spell names. DNA doesn't forget. Stories survive in whispers until someone shouts them. 5 families. This is just 5. How many more are buried in unmarked graves, under paved-over districts, in sealed archives? The question isn't, did black people build wealth? The question is, who profited from erasing it? And what are you going to do now that you know? The silence ends with you. Share this story. Make them remember what they tried to forget. Because erasure only works when we let it.